Welcome to our podcast. Today we're diving into the alarming risk of poverty for single-parent families. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this topic. What's the key issue that's come up recently?
So, according to the latest government data, single-parent families are facing a much higher risk of poverty compared to other households. It's quite concerning.
Really? What's causing that spike?
Well, for starters, the low standard of living rate for a household with one adult and one child is about 29.5% over the average across tax classes, and it gets worse as the number of children increases.
Do we know how much worse?
Yeah, for a single parent with two children, the rate jumps to 38.5%.
Oh, man.
And if they have three or more kids, it skyrockets to 64.5%.
64.5%? That's massive. Is this data specific to Luxembourg?
Yes, this is from Luxembourg's government data, but it highlights a broader issue with single-parent households facing higher poverty risks. It's not just a local problem.
Right? And I imagine that having just one income makes it really tough to manage expenses.
Exactly. When there's only one earner, and especially if they're earning close to the social minimum wage, it's like trying to stretch a rubber band that's already about to snap.
Yeah.
It just doesn't go far enough.
That makes sense. But aren't there social programs to help support these families?
There are, but sometimes they're not sufficient. Plus, the data shows that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 employees have a low income, depending on the data source. So it's not just single parents who are struggling.
I see. But doesn't Luxembourg have a relatively high standard of living overall?
It does, but that also means the cost of living is higher. So, earning the social minimum wage is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. It never quite fills up.
Right.
And that's especially challenging for single-parent households.
That's a good point. So what are the main factors contributing to this issue?
Well, Ministers Martine Deprez and Gil Roth mentioned that factors like household composition and tax class play a role. The more children in a single-parent household, the higher the risk of poverty.
But isn't that kind of expected? More kids mean more expenses, right?
True, but it's the scale that's alarming. Going from 29.5% to 64.5% is a huge increase. It's not just a small jump.
Fair enough. So, what did the ministers suggest to address this issue?
They didn't outline specific solutions, but highlighted that these statistics could push for policy changes.
Yeah.
Social support systems may need adjustments to better support single-parent families.
I agree. But do you think increasing financial aid is enough?
That's a good question. Financial aid helps, but we might also need affordable childcare, flexible work options, and access to education and training. It's a complex problem.
Definitely. But I wonder if the data captures the full picture. Does it consider non-residents or income from abroad?
Actually, the Luxembourg Inland Revenue noted biases in the data, especially in capturing the global income of non-residents and residents with foreign income. So the situation might be more complicated than it seems.
So it's possible the risk is underreported?
Possibly. The data might not account for all variables. But regardless, the numbers we have are alarming enough.
Absolutely.
Action is needed.
Yeah, I think so too. Sometimes statistics don't fully convey the real struggles people face daily.
Exactly. Behind every number, there's a family trying to make ends meet. It's important to remember that.
So how can we as a society help address this issue?
Well, it's like trying to fix a sinking ship. You can't just bail out water. You need to patch the hole.
Exactly.
We need systemic solutions.
That's a great analogy. So, implementing policies that support wage growth, affordable housing, and better social services?
Yes, and perhaps tax reforms that provide more relief to single-parent families. It's about creating a fairer system.
Makes sense. Do you think the government is ready to make these changes?
I hope so. The minister's response suggests they're aware.
True.
Public pressure can lead to action.
Well, raising awareness is key.
Absolutely. The more people know, the more momentum we have for change.
Yep.
Every voice counts.
Maybe community initiatives can help in the meantime.
Definitely. Local support can make a real difference. Every
Agreed.
effort helps.
This has been a...
Hey, did you hear about the latest stats on single-parent families and poverty rates? It's pretty alarming.
Really? What's going on?
Well, according to recent data from the government, single-parent families have the highest rate of low living standards, and it gets worse as the number of children increases.
Wait, so you're saying the more kids a single parent has, the higher the risk of poverty?
Exactly. For a household with one adult and one child, the low standard of living rate is 29.5% over the average of the country's 3 tax classes. But if there's one adult with 3 or more children, that rate jumps to 64.5%.
That's over half. That's really concerning.
Yeah, it is. And, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 employees have a low income. It depends on how you look at the data, but either way, it's significant.
But don't we have measures in place to support low-income families?
We do, but apparently, they're not enough. Ministers Martine Dupré and Gil Roth pointed out that despite these measures, many families still fall below the low standard of living threshold.
Right.
In 2023, that threshold is estimated at $28,121 per adult per year.
And a single person earning the social minimum wage just barely meets that?
Exactly. With an annual income of $28,398, they're just $277 over the threshold.
Wow.
So any small setback could push them below the line.
That's tight. But isn't the average risk of poverty lower for households without children?
Yes, households without children have a much lower risk. For instance, the risk is only about 12% for people living in households without children. Compare that to over 43% for single-parent families.
That's a massive difference. But are these figures specific to Luxembourg?
Yep, they're specific to Luxembourg. The data comes from the Inspectorate General of Social Security and the Luxembourg Inland Revenue. It's a localized issue they're trying to address.
I wonder if the high cost of living there is a contributing factor.
That's a good point. Luxembourg does have a high cost of living, which undoubtedly affects these statistics.
Yeah.
Plus, housing costs are soaring.
But didn't they mention something about biases in the data?
Yes, they did. The ministers noted that depending on whether you use data from the IGSS or the Luxembourg Inland Revenue, the numbers can vary. There are difficulties capturing the global income of non-residents and residents with income abroad.
So, the actual situation might be even more complex than it appears?
Exactly. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle without all the pieces.
Right.
We have to consider that some data might not be fully accurate.
But still, the trends are clear. Single-parent families are at a disadvantage.
Absolutely. And it's not just single-parent families. For 2 adults with 4 or more children, the low living standard rate rises to 50.8%. So larger families in general are facing challenges.
That's interesting because you'd think dual-income households would fare better.
You'd think so. But with more children, expenses skyrocket. And if one parent isn't working to take care of the kids, that reduces income.
True, childcare costs can be prohibitive.
Exactly. And when you add housing, education, and daily expenses, it's a recipe for financial strain. It's a cycle that's hard to break.
I can't help but wonder if policy changes could help alleviate this situation.
Well, the ministers are aware of the issue. They're responding to questions from MPs Sam Tanson and Juna Bernard from Degreng, the Green Party.
Right.
So it's definitely on the political agenda.
But are any concrete measures being proposed?
Not in this particular data release. But highlighting the problem is the first step.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it leads to actionable solutions like increased social support or tax relief for single-parent families.
I hope so. It's crucial to support those who are most vulnerable.
Definitely. And education plays a role too. Raising awareness can mobilize public support. Maybe NGOs and community organizations can step in where the government can't.
That's a good point. But I think the government should take the lead here. It's a systemic issue.
True, but sometimes bureaucracy slows things down.
Right.
Community initiatives can act faster in some cases.
But without policy changes, it's like we're treating the symptoms, not the disease.
You're right. Long-term solutions require policy reform.
Yeah.
Things like affordable housing, accessible childcare, and fair wages are essential.
Speaking of wages, didn't they mention that 38,041 employees received the non-qualified minimum social wage?
Yes, in March 2022, that was 8.7% of the employed population. It's a significant number.
And that doesn't even account for the self-employed or civil servants?
Exactly. So the actual number of people struggling could be even higher. It's a bit disheartening.
It is. But maybe this data will be a wake-up call.
Hopefully. Awareness is the first step toward change. We need
Yeah.
to keep the conversation going.
Agreed. Let's make sure this doesn't just fade away in the news cycle.
Absolutely. It's up to all of us to advocate for those who need it most. Every voice
Right.
counts.
Well, this has been enlightening, albeit a bit heavy.
True, but sometimes the tough conversations are the most important ones. Today we're tackling a pressing issue, the alarming risk of poverty for single-parent families in Luxembourg. Let's get started.
Yeah, it's such a critical topic. Can you, walk us through the latest findings?
Sure thing. According to recent data from the government, drawing on information from the Inspectorate General of Social Security and the Luxembourg Inland Revenue, single-parent families are facing the highest rates of low living standards. And what's even more concerning is that this rate increases with the number of children in the household.
Wow, that's really alarming. Do we have specific figures on that?
Yes, we do. For instance, in households consisting of one adult with one child, the low standard of living rate is 29.5% over the average of the country's three tax classes, 1, 1A, and 2. But if we're talking
Right.
about one adult with two children, that rate jumps to 38.5%. And get this, for one adult with three or more children, it skyrockets to 64.5%.
That's just shocking. It's like the more kids you have, the deeper you sink into poverty.
Exactly. It's a harsh reality. Meanwhile, in two adult households with one child, the rate is significantly lower, at just 8.1%. So there's a stark contrast there.
I see. So what about the overall population? How does this compare?
Good question. In 2024, the low standard of living rate stood at 11.9% for the population as a
Okay.
whole. So single-parent families are well above that average, especially those with more children.
That's a significant disparity. But I'm curious. How are these figures calculated? Are they consistent across different data sources?
Actually, that's an interesting point. There are differences depending on the data source. The Inspectorate General of Social Security, IGSS, uses one method, while the Luxembourg Inland Revenue, ACD, uses another. For example, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 employees have a low income, but it depends on whether the data comes from the IGSS or the ACD.
So can we trust these numbers then?
Well, both sources have their limitations. The ministers, Health and Social Security Minister Martine Deprez and Finance Minister Gilles Roth, acknowledged this in their response to parliamentary questions from Diegreng MPs Sam Tanson and Juna Bernard.
Right.
They pointed out biases in the data, especially concerning non-residents and residents with income from abroad.
Ah, that makes sense. But regardless of the exact figures, the trend is clear. Single-parent families are disproportionately affected.
Exactly. It's like trying to climb a mountain with a heavy backpack. The odds are
Yeah.
stacked against them.
So what's contributing to this issue? Is it the tax system, lack of social support, or something else?
It's a combination of factors. For one, the cost of living in Luxembourg is quite high. Housing, childcare, and everyday expenses all add up, and single parents have to shoulder these costs alone.
That must be incredibly challenging, especially when their income is close to or even below the unqualified social minimum wage.
Exactly. The annual disposable income for a single employee working full-time at minimum wage is just above the low standard of living threshold.
Right.
It's only a difference of 270 fisaren, which is, not much at all.
That's barely any cushion. One unexpected expense could push them below the threshold.
Precisely. And for those with multiple children, the situation is even more precarious.
Yeah.
The low standard of living rate for a household with one adult and 3 or more children rises to 64.5%.
More than half. It's unacceptable in a developed nation.
Absolutely. It raises important questions about our social policies and support systems. Are they sufficient to help these families?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? What steps is the government taking to address this issue?
According to the minister's response, they acknowledge the problem, but it's unclear what specific measures are being implemented.
Right.
The data highlights the need for targeted support.
I wonder if increasing access to affordable childcare or housing support could make a significant difference.
Definitely. It's like giving someone a lifeline when they're sinking.
Yeah.
It won't solve everything, but it can help them stay afloat.
That's a good point. But perhaps more systemic changes are needed too, like adjusting tax policies or increasing minimum wages.
I agree. And maybe reviewing social benefits to ensure they're reaching those most in need.
Right.
It's a complex issue that requires a multifaceted approach.
Absolutely. But now, Playing devil's advocate here, some might argue that it's not solely the government's responsibility.
That's true, but as a society, we share collective responsibility. Supporting vulnerable groups ultimately benefits everyone.
I see your point. Investing in these families could reduce long-term social costs.
Exactly. Preventing poverty now could lessen the burden on healthcare, education, and social services in the future.
Yeah.
It's both a moral and practical imperative.
Well said. But then, how do we ensure that the assistance provided is effective and reaches those who need it most?
That's a challenge. It requires accurate data and efficient systems.
Right.
The discrepancies in data we mentioned earlier highlight the need for better tracking and assessment.
Indeed. Without reliable information, policymaking becomes a shot in the dark.
Exactly. We need to shed light on the issue with transparent and comprehensive data.
Yeah.
Only then can we craft effective solutions.
So, to sum up, there are significant risks of poverty among single-parent families in Luxembourg, especially as the number of children increases.
Yes, and addressing this issue requires coordinated efforts from the government, social institutions, and the community at large.
Right.
It's not an easy fix, but it's essential.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an enlightening discussion.
Definitely. It's a topic that deserves more attention. Hopefully, awareness will lead to action.
Let's hope so. Thanks for sharing these insights.
My pleasure. You know, I was reading this report about poverty rates among single-parent families in Luxembourg,
Yeah.
and it's really quite alarming.
Really?
Right.
What's the situation like?
Well, it turns out that single-parent families have the highest rate of low living standards.
Wow.
And the risk increases the more children they have.
That's concerning.
It is.
Do you have any specifics on the numbers?
Yeah, according to data from the government, the risk of poverty for single-parent families is over 43% compared
That's
to just
high.
12% for people living in households without children.
So basically, if you're a single parent, you're much
Exactly.
more likely to face poverty?
Exactly. And it gets worse with more kids. For a household with one adult and one child, the low standard of living rate is 29.5%, but for one adult with 3 or more children, it skyrockets to 64.5%.
That's over half?
I know.
That's huge. Why is that happening?
Well, there are several factors. One is the dependency ratio. It's like a single income supporting multiple dependents, which really strains the financial
Right.
resources.
Makes sense. But
Yeah.
what about government support or social programs? Are they not helping?
They do help, but perhaps not enough. The ministers, Dupre and Roth, responded to parliamentary questions
I see.
with data showing that even with social programs, the rates are still high.
So, what's the threshold for low living standards in Luxembourg?
Good question. It's estimated at 28,120 per adult equivalent per year,
Okay.
which is 60% of the median annual standard of living.
And how does that compare to the minimum wage?
Well, the annual disposable income of a single employee working full-time at the unskilled social minimum wage is about $28,398.18, so barely above the low standard threshold.
So single individuals are just scraping by, but
Exactly.
single parents are falling below that line?
Exactly, and the more children they have, the further below they fall, which is really alarming.
Right? It seems like having additional children exponentially increases the financial burden.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like trying to stretch a single salary to cover multiple people, and it's just not
Exactly.
enough.
But couldn't it also be that the data doesn't capture other forms of income or support?
Well, that's a fair point. The Luxembourg Inland Revenue did mention that some data might be biased due to
Right.
difficulty in capturing all income sources, especially for non-residents.
So maybe the situation isn't as dire as it seems?
Perhaps. But even accounting for that, the trends are still worrying,
True.
and single-parent families remain the most vulnerable group.
Yeah, I suppose regardless of data nuances, the risk is significant.
Definitely. Exactly. And when you compare to two adult households, the difference is stark. For
Yes.
example, two adults with one child have a low standard of living rate of just 8.1%.
That's a massive difference compared to single parents.
It is. Absolutely. It shows how much having a second income or support can make a difference in reducing
Definitely.
poverty risk.
So what can be done to address this issue?
Well, policy measures could focus on providing more support to single-parent families, like increased child allowances or affordable childcare options.
And maybe initiatives to improve employment opportunities for single parents?
Exactly. Yes, like flexible work schedules or remote work
Right.
options would help them balance work and parenting.
It's like giving them the tools to support their families without being stretched too thin.
Exactly. Right, because expecting someone to work full time and single handedly raise children is, well, a
For
heavy
sure.
load and not sustainable without support.
I hope policymakers take these statistics seriously and implement changes.
Me too. Agreed. No one should have to choose between putting food on the table and spending time with their children. It's just not right.
Exactly. Maybe we should raise more awareness about this issue.
Definitely. Definitely. The more people understand the challenges these families face, the more pressure there will
Right.
be for change.
Well, thanks for bringing this up. It's eye-opening.
Anytime, anytime. It's important we talk about these things and work
Absolutely.
towards solutions.
Maybe next time we can dive into potential policy solutions in more depth.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. I'm up for it. Today we're discussing an alarming new report about the rising risk of poverty among single parent families in Luxembourg. Let's dive in.
That sounds really concerning. What's the main takeaway from the report?
Well, the government's data shows that single parent families are facing the highest rates of low living standards. And, the risk actually increases with the number of children they have.
Wait, so the more kids, the higher the risk?
Exactly. For a household with one adult and one child, the low standard of living rate is 29.5%. But for
Wow.
a single parent with three or more children, it jumps to a staggering 64.5%.
64.5%? That's over half of these families.
Yeah, it's really startling. And just to put that in context, the overall population's rate is around 11.9%.
Right.
So single parent households are disproportionately affected.
That's shocking. Do we know why single parent families are so much more at risk?
Well, supporting a family on a single income is incredibly challenging, especially in Luxembourg, where the cost of living is high.
Yeah.
Plus, they might have limited access to affordable childcare, making it harder to work full time.
It's like trying to juggle while riding a unicycle. Almost impossible.
Exactly. And when you have more children, it's like adding more balls to the juggling act.
Right.
It becomes unsustainable without support.
How does this compare to two-parent households? Are they facing similar risks?
Not to the same extent. For two adults with one child, the low standard of living rate is just 8.1%.
Okay.
Even with three children, it only rises to 22.4%, which is significantly lower than for single parents.
So having two incomes really makes a difference.
Absolutely. Two incomes can provide a buffer against financial hardship. Single parents don't have that safety net.
Were there any solutions proposed in the report?
Well, the ministers provided the data in response to a parliamentary question, but specific solutions weren't detailed.
I see.
However, highlighting the issue is a step toward addressing it.
Right, but awareness isn't enough. We need action.
Agreed. It's crucial for policymakers to implement measures that support single-parent families.
Definitely.
Things like increased childcare subsidies or tax benefits could help.
Speaking of taxes, how do different tax classes affect these statistics?
That's an interesting point. The data shows variations across tax classes. For example, the low standard of living rate for households in tax class 1A is 17%.
Okay.
But for single-parent households, it's much higher.
So tax policies might be contributing to the problem?
Possibly. The tax system may not sufficiently alleviate the burden on single parents.
Right.
Reevaluating tax classes could be part of the solution.
You know, sometimes I wonder if the data might not capture the full picture. Could there be discrepancies?
Actually, you're onto something. The report mentions discrepancies between data sources like the IGSS and the inland revenue. Depending on which data you look at, the numbers vary significantly.
That could make it hard to develop effective policies if we're not working with accurate data.
Exactly. Accurate data is essential for understanding the scope of the issue and targeting interventions effectively. It's
Right.
like trying to fix a leak without knowing where it's coming from.
So we need better data collection methods?
Yes, and perhaps more collaboration between agencies to ensure consistency.
Yeah.
That way, policymakers can make informed decisions.
It's surprising that in a wealthy country like Luxembourg, such a high percentage of single-parent families are struggling.
It really is. It shows that economic prosperity doesn't always translate to equitable living standards for everyone.
Exactly.
There's still work to be done to address inequalities.
Do you think societal attitudes play a role here?
Possibly. There might be social stigmas attached to single parenthood that affect access to resources. Plus, policies may not be adequately designed to support non-traditional family structures.
That's a good point. Addressing this issue might require not just economic measures, but also social change.
Absolutely. It's about creating an inclusive society that supports all family types.
Right.
Education and awareness can help shift perceptions.
Maybe community programs could provide support networks for single parents.
That could be very beneficial. Peer support and resource sharing can alleviate some of the burdens. It takes a village, as they say.
Indeed. It's clear that a multifaceted approach is needed.
Agreed. Financial assistance, policy reform, societal support, all are crucial.
Yeah.
We can't rely on a one-size-fits-all solution.
Well, this discussion has been really enlightening. Thanks for shedding light on this important topic.
My pleasure. It's vital that we continue to bring attention to these issues.
Absolutely.
The more we know, the better equipped we are to make a difference.
Hopefully, our listeners are inspired to take action, or at least spread the word.
Definitely. Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going. So I've been looking at the latest government data on single-parent families, and it's pretty alarming. The risk
Really?
of poverty is much higher than I thought.
That's concerning. What's the data saying?
Well, for a single parent with one child, the low standard of living rate is 29.5% over the average of the country's tax classes. But for
Wow.
those with 3 or more children, it skyrockets to 64.5%.
64.5%? That's massive.
Exactly. And when you compare that to two-parent households, the difference is stark. For example, 2 adults with 1 child have a rate of just 8.1%. It's a huge
Right.
gap.
That disparity is huge. Do we know why single-parent families are at such a disadvantage?
Well, it's partly because they have only one income source, and they often face challenges balancing work and childcare.
That makes sense. But aren't there social benefits to help alleviate some of that burden?
They do help, but perhaps not enough. According to ministers Martin Deprez and Gil Roth, around 25.6% of employees earning close to the social minimum wage have low
Okay.
incomes. And depending on the data source, it could be even higher.
Right, but isn't there a discrepancy between different data sources?
Yes, exactly. The IGSS data and the ACD data show different figures due to their methodologies.
I
This
see.
makes it harder to pinpoint the exact situation.
But regardless of the exact numbers, the trend is clear, right?
Absolutely. Single-parent families are at a higher risk of poverty. And it's not just about income, it's also about the cost of living and insufficient support.
Right. You know, I can't help but wonder if we're perhaps not looking at deeper systemic issues here.
What do you mean?
Well, maybe it's not just about income levels, but also about access to affordable childcare, flexible work arrangements, and societal support. Perhaps we need to address those too.
You have a point. Focusing solely on income might overlook other crucial factors, but income is still a significant part of the problem.
True?
Without adequate earnings, it's hard to make ends meet.
That's fair. So what can be done to help these families?
Well, policy changes could help. Increasing social benefits, providing more affordable housing, and improving access to childcare could make a big difference.
Definitely. It's like we're expecting single parents to juggle everything without enough support.
Exactly. And it's like trying to carry all the groceries in one trip, but with one
yeah.
hand tied behind your back.
That's a good analogy. It's just not practical.
Right. And the data backs this up. The low standard of living threshold is $21 per adult per year. Single parents earning minimum wage barely reach this threshold.
That's tough. So, what about couples? How do they compare?
Well, couples with children have lower rates of low living standards. For 2 adults with 2 children, the rate is only 9.1%. It's a
Wow.
significant difference.
But then, shouldn't we be focusing on more targeted support for single-parent families?
Absolutely. We need policies that address their specific challenges.
Right?
Things like increasing childcare subsidies or offering flexible work hours.
And maybe more community support programs.
Yes, that's important too. Social isolation can exacerbate financial struggles. Building a support network can make a big difference.
You know, it's interesting how the data varies between different sources.
Yeah, that's a good point. The IGSS and the ACD have different methods, which can lead to different conclusions.
Exactly. Do you think that affects how policies are made?
It could. If policymakers rely on different data, they might prioritize different issues.
True.
Consistency in data is crucial for effective solutions.
So maybe improving data collection should be a priority as well.
Definitely. Accurate data helps us understand the real scope of the problem.
Yes.
And it's essential for creating targeted interventions.
Well, it's clear that single-parent families need more support.
Absolutely. And as a society, we have a responsibility to ensure that everyone has a fair chance.
Agreed. Let's hope that these alarming statistics lead to meaningful action.
Yeah, we can only hope. But awareness is the first step.
Exactly. Well, thanks for shedding light on this issue.
No problem. It's an important topic to discuss.
Definitely.